Before belief took shape in words, before explanation learned to defend itself, there was experience. Human consciousness has never been fixed. It shifts with hunger. It deepens in darkness. It loosens its boundaries in rhythm. Long before meaning was sought, these changes were already present. The mind learned to move before it learned to explain. Early human life unfolded close to thresholds, between day and night, between safety and exposure. The world offered no clear boundary between what was seen and what was sensed. Dream and waking overlapped. Fear and awe felt the same in the body. In this environment, altered states were not rare. They were part of life. Illness brought visions. Exhaustion bent time. Grief opened inner spaces that could not be closed at will. These states arrived without invitation. The problem was never their existence. It was how to live with them. Across distant regions, among peoples with no shared language, the same challenge appeared. Consciousness sometimes departed from its familiar form. For most, the experience passed. For some, it returned. And for a few, it endured. Such experiences were not immediately meaningful. They were disruptive. They unsettled identity. They disturbed the group. In small communities, no inner disturbance was private. Unexplained suffering created fear. Fear demanded orientation. Over time, a pattern emerged. Certain individuals entered these altered states and did not disappear. They returned, not unchanged, but intact. This mattered, because altered consciousness was not only dangerous, it could also bring clarity, relief, or order, if return was possible. These individuals were not chosen. They were recognized after survival. Someone had crossed inward thresholds and come back. Across forests, plains, deserts, and ice, a similar role began to take shape. Not as an institution, not as a religion, as a function. Where altered consciousness persisted, someone learned how to accompany it. The symbols differed, the stories varied, but the structure remained. There was an inward movement. There was risk. There was return. And there was usefulness. At this stage, there was no doctrine, only observation. What stabilized the journey was remembered. What overwhelmed was avoided. This was not faith. It was refinement. The role remained flexible, local, unfixed. The community learned two things at once: that altered consciousness was dangerous, and that it could be survived, that it threatened order, and that it could restore balance. What we now call shamanism did not begin as belief. It emerged as response. This was the first threshold. Not mastery, but recognition that return was possible. What follows is the story of those individuals themselves and the discipline required to survive what others could not. Not everyone who entered these inner states returned. Some were overwhelmed, some fractured, some lost the ability to live among others. Altered consciousness left unchecked could destroy a life. Those who became useful to the group were not those who entered deepest, but those who learned how to come back. In many cases, this learning was forced. illness that lingered, dreams that did not end with waking, periods of confusion that separated the individual from ordinary time. These were not sought experiences, they were endured. At first, the state dominated, attention scattered, identity loosened, the body weakened. Without restraint, such experiences were dangerous. But where survival was possible, pattern emerged. Across cultures, the same slow discipline appeared. Breath steadied the mind, rhythm anchored perception, stillness prevented collapse. What mattered was not explanation, but regulation. Learning when to enter, learning when to stop, learning how to return. This distinction became decisive. Others entered altered states accidentally, through illness, grief, exhaustion. The shaman entered deliberately. Control did not mean domination, it meant familiarity. The state was no longer foreign. Because of this, the shaman became functional. When others were overwhelmed by fear, they could remain present. When suffering carried meaning no one could name, they could enter its symbolic terrain. They did not cure every illness. They did not end death. They restored orientation. This role did not place them above the community. It kept them near its edge, respected, observed, never entirely safe. Those who crossed thresholds repeatedly were never fully ordinary again. Their authority was limited by necessity. They were needed only as long as imbalance persisted. Knowledge was not preserved in texts, it passed through proximity, by watching, by repetition, by survival. What worked endured, what failed vanished. There was no central doctrine, only practice. This is why the form remained consistent without coordination. Different names, different symbols, the same function. Someone who could enter altered consciousness and return with coherence. Shamanism at this stage was not spiritual identity, it was a response to instability, a way of preventing inward rupture from becoming social fracture. The shaman did not resolve chaos, they mediated it. This balance was fragile. It depended on restraint, on limits, on the ability to stop. Without technique, power turned destructive. This necessity would shape everything that followed. In the next movement, we turn to the methods themselves, the techniques that allowed passage without collapse. Once return became possible, attention shifted. The question was no longer whether altered consciousness existed, but how it could be entered without losing oneself. Experience alone was not enough. Survival required method. Across distant cultures, without shared language or contact, similar techniques began to appear. Not theories, not beliefs, practices. They emerged from observation. What steadied perception was kept. What overwhelmed was abandoned. Rhythm was among the first. Repeated sound reorganized attention. Drumming, rattling, clapping, simple patterns that narrowed awareness. As rhythm continued, thought slowed. Time loosened. The body responded before the mind. Breath followed. Slowed breathing anchored sensation. Altered breathing deepened it. Control of breath did not explain the experience, it shaped it. Breath became a boundary between ordinary awareness and inward movement. Stillness mattered as much as movement. Extended immobility altered perception. Darkness amplified inner imagery. Silence intensified sensation. These conditions were not symbolic, they were functional. They reduced distraction. Across landscapes, shamans learned where perception shifted most easily. At night, in forests, in caves, near water. These places were not chosen at random. They changed the mind. Environment became part of the method. Fasting appeared repeatedly. Without food, the body altered its priorities. Sensation sharpened. Dream and waking blurred. Used carefully, deprivation opened perception. Used without restraint, it destroyed it. Technique always required limits. In some regions, plants entered the practice, not as sacraments, not as escape, as tools. Their use was restrained. Dosage mattered. Context mattered. Guidance mattered. Without containment, they were dangerous. What unified these methods was not their symbolism, but their reliability. They produced repeatable changes in perception. This repeatability mattered. It meant the state could be entered and exited with some consistency. None of this required belief. The body responded regardless of interpretation. Whether explained as spirit, ancestor, or force, the experience arrived all the same. Explanation followed experience, not the other way around. Over time, these repeated journeys generated internal maps. Not conceptual ones, experiential ones. Perception seemed layered. There was ordinary awareness. There was the inward realm. There was return. Language struggled to keep up. To describe these movements, spatial metaphors emerged. Upper, lower, middle. Not as geography, but as orientation. They helped memory hold what experience could not. Within these inner spaces, figures appeared. Animals, ancestors, forces with form. They were not chosen. They emerged. They provided structure, movement, direction, constraint. These forms were not arbitrary. They reflected attention. Animals carried qualities: speed, strength, endurance. They guided behavior within the altered state. They functioned as navigational tools. What mattered was not whether these figures were real in an external sense. What mattered was their effect. They stabilized experience. They guided return. They prevented collapse. Shamanic practice, therefore, did not separate inner experience from physical discipline. The body remained central. Technique anchored imagination. Without the body, there was no return. These methods did not eliminate danger. They managed it. Altered consciousness was never safe, only contained. Containment was the achievement. In the next movement, we turn to what these journeys were used for. Not exploration, but restoration. The journeys were never undertaken for their own sake. Altered states were not valued because they were unusual, but because they were useful. They addressed disturbance. In early communities, illness was rarely understood as isolated malfunction. Suffering appeared as imbalance, a loss of coherence, a fracture in relationship, between the body and itself, between the person and the group, between the living and what was unseen. Healing required more than intervention. It required orientation. The shaman entered altered consciousness not to escape the world, but to engage with disorder on its own terms. The journey followed the logic of the disturbance. Where identity felt diminished, something was sought. Where fear felt invasive, something was removed. These actions were described as retrieval and extraction. not metaphorically, functionally. They provided form to experiences that resisted ordinary language. The patient did not need to believe. The community did not need to agree. The act itself mattered. Within the altered state, fragmentation could be approached without panic. The shaman remained coherent where others could not. This coherence was the work. It allowed suffering to be externalized. When pain took shape, it could be confronted. When loss became representable, it could be returned. The process did not deny illness, it reconfigured it. Meaning restored orientation where explanation failed. These rituals were never private. They involved witnesses, participants, shared attention. Healing required recognition as much as technique. The community held the space. By naming disorder and locating it outside the individual, the ritual prevented isolation. Suffering was no longer silent. It had a place, a beginning, an end. This containment mattered. The shaman did not claim authority over life or death. Their role was limited. They mediated between states. They restored balance. When stability returned, their function receded. Power dissolved with necessity. Because of this, shamanic practice resisted centralization. It could not become law. It could not govern daily life. It appeared only where disruption appeared. Its authority was temporary. As societies changed, other systems absorbed some of these functions. Formal medicine addressed the body. Religion addressed meaning. Shamanism retreated to the margins. But it did not disappear. In moments of crisis, when institutions failed to orient experience, the older pattern returned. Altered states resurfaced. Individuals crossed thresholds again. And once more, someone learned how to return. In the final movement, we turn to the present, to what remains when communal containment weakens. Healing, in these early contexts, was never only about the individual. It concerned balance between person and environment, between inner state and shared life. Illness was not viewed as random. It was a signal. When someone withdrew, lost energy, or became disconnected, the disturbance was visible. Work was interrupted, relationships strained, rhythm was broken. The group felt the fracture. Shamanic healing addressed this visibility. The process did not begin with diagnosis, but with attention. Who had changed? How? For how long? Suffering had to be located before it could be engaged. The shaman did not speak in abstraction. They listened. They observed. They entered the altered state where the disturbance was felt to originate. Healing required movement into the same terrain where imbalance had formed. In these journeys, illness often appeared as absence, something missing, a loss of vitality, a gap in continuity. This was not interpreted as metaphor, it was treated as condition. Loss required retrieval. The ritual framed return. Through song, gesture, or narrative movement, what was absent was represented and brought back. The patient did not act alone. They were accompanied. This accompaniment mattered. Without it, the experience could deepen isolation. With it, the individual remained anchored to the group. Healing was relational. The shaman did not claim ownership of the outcome. If restoration occurred, it was attributed to balance returning. If it did not, limits were acknowledged. This restraint preserved trust. Over time, these practices shaped community expectation. Illness was not hidden. Suffering was not private. It was addressed openly within shared ritual. The group learned how to hold disturbance. These rituals also protected the shaman. They were never solely responsible for recovery. Witnesses shared the weight. Attention was distributed. Responsibility remained collective. Healing, in this sense, was not cure. It was reintegration, a return to participation, a restoration of rhythm. This outcome mattered more than explanation. In the movement that follows, we look at what happens when this shared containment weakens, when suffering is isolated, and altered states return without communal structure. As communal structures weakened, something was lost. Not belief, but containment. Altered states did not disappear. They returned without guidance. In larger, more complex societies, suffering became private. Illness moved behind walls. Grief shortened. Silence replaced ritual. What once belonged to the group was carried alone. Attention narrowed. When altered consciousness arose, it no longer had a place to land. There were no shared symbols, no witnesses, no structured return. Experience detached from meaning. Some sought explanation, others sought suppression. Few learned how to accompany the state itself. The result was fragmentation. Inner experience is multiplied without orientation. Where shamanic cultures externalized disturbance, modern systems internalized it. Suffering became pathology. Visions became symptoms. This reclassification solved certain problems. It created others. Meaning was narrowed. Without communal ritual, altered states lost their social function. They no longer restored balance. They isolated. The individual carried the entire weight of interpretation. This weight was often too heavy. In response, fragments resurfaced. Practices detached from lineage. Techniques removed from restraint. Rhythm without context. Substances without containment. Power without boundary. The appeal was not novelty, it was absence. Where structure had vanished, experience rushed to fill the space. But without limits, experience overwhelmed. The danger returned. What shamanic systems had managed carefully, entry, navigation, return, now occurred without sequence. The threshold remained, the guide did not. This was not a failure of individuals, it was a structural loss. Yet the recurrence itself is telling. Again and again, human consciousness exceeds its container. Again and again, people search for ways to follow it safely. The need persists. Shamanism, in its original form, did not offer belief. It offered responsibility, limits, timing, return. Without these, altered states remain unresolved. The future does not depend on reviving old forms intact, nor on rejecting them entirely. It depends on recognizing what they addressed. The management of inner disorder as a shared task. What remains after belief systems shift and institutions change is the same human capacity. Attention moves inward. Perception alters. Meaning seeks form. The question is no longer whether these states exist. It is how they are met. In the final passage, we allow the documentary to settle, not into conclusion, but into awareness. At the end of these movements, nothing is resolved. Human consciousness continues to shift, to exceed its own boundaries, to return altered. This has never stopped. What changes is how it is held. Across time, communities learned ways to accompany these movements, not to explain them fully, not to control them completely, but to give them form, limit, and return. These practices did not endure because they were ancient, but because they answered a need. As structures dissolve and reform, the need remains. Attention still drifts. Rivalry still spreads. Suffering still seeks meaning. The conditions repeat. What once occurred by firelight now unfolds in isolation. The threshold remains. The crossing still happens. What is uncertain is the return. This uncertainty is not a failure. It is an invitation to notice. Not to revive the past unchanged, not to abandon it entirely, but to observe what was being done. Containment, responsibility, restraint. The future does not depend on belief. It depends on attention, on recognizing when inner movement requires shared ground. Without spectacle, without certainty, the world continues. Wind moves through trees. Water shapes land. Night follows day. Human consciousness moves with them, and will continue to do so. What remains is not instruction, but awareness. Not answers, but pause.